In 1929, inside the dusty archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a librarian unrolled a torn piece of gazelle skin parchment and found something that shouldn't exist. A map drawn in 1513, showing coastlines that wouldn't be officially charted for another 300 years. And according to some very enthusiastic YouTube videos, documentaries and late-night internet rabbit holes, it shows Antarctica. Not just Antarctica, but Antarctica without its ice sheet. The actual bedrock coastline, sitting under 2 miles of ice today, supposedly drawn by a 16th century Ottoman admiral who had no business knowing what lay beneath a continent nobody had even discovered yet. If that's true, it's one of the greatest mysteries in the history of cartography. It would mean somebody, somewhere, mapped Antarctica thousands of years before it was covered in ice, and that knowledge somehow survived, got copied, recopied, and ended up in the hands of a Turkish admiral in 1513. That's not a small claim. That's a claim that rewrites everything we think we know about ancient civilizations, lost technology, maybe even lost history itself. But here's the question nobody seems to be asking loudly enough. What does the map actually show? Not what people say it shows. Not what fits a good story. What's actually drawn on that fragile piece of parchment sitting in a climate-controlled room in Istanbul right now. Because there's a pretty big difference between those two things, and untangling it is going to take us somewhere far more interesting than a simple yes or no answer. If you're listening to this while drifting off, that's exactly what this is for. So go ahead and follow, and tell me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is right there. I love checking and seeing it's midnight in Manila, dinner time in Denver, and sunrise in Sydney, all at the same moment. This map has travelled across 5 centuries to reach you. Kind of fitting that we're all scattered across time zones listening to its story together. Now, over the next while, we're going to actually investigate this properly. We'll start with how this fragment was discovered and what Piri Reis himself claimed about where he got his information. Then we're going to step back and look at how mapmaking actually worked in the 1500s. Because dead reckoning, Portolan charts, and constant copying created some very strange and misleading results. Results that can look uncannily accurate if you squint the right way. We'll read the map's own margin notes, in Piri Reis's own words about his sources. We'll examine the southern coastline piece by piece and ask whether it's Antarctica or something much closer to home, like Patagonia bending south. We'll dig into Terra Australis, the imaginary southern continent that haunted European mapmakers for centuries before anyone actually found Antarctica. And we'll weigh the competing theories, ancient lost civilizations, secret Portuguese exploration, simple copying errors, against what the physical and historical evidence can and can't actually prove. Because that's the real trick with a mystery like this. Evidence can support a theory, it can be consistent with a theory. But consistent with isn't the same as proof. And by the end you're going to understand exactly why this map keeps getting resurrected every few years, why it refuses to die quietly in an archive, and why the truth might be even stranger than the myth. If this kind of deep dive is your thing, following on Spotify gets you the ad-free version, it's the best way to support what I do here, and a 5-star review genuinely helps more people find these stories. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to 1929, to that library, and that unrolled piece of gazelle skin. So who was this man whose name got attached to one of the strangest documents in cartographic history? Piri Reis wasn't some obscure scribe doodling in the margins of empire. He was a genuine heavyweight of Ottoman naval power, a career sailor and cartographer who eventually rose to become an admiral in the Ottoman fleet. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was a famous privateer and naval commander, and young Piri learned the trade of seafaring, warfare and mapmaking directly from him. sailing the Mediterranean for years before settling down to compile everything he'd learned into written and drawn form. This wasn't a hobbyist. This was a professional whose life depended on accurate charts, because in the Mediterranean of the early 1500s, a bad map could sink a fleet or lose a war. That matters, because it means whatever Piri Reis produced wasn't the work of a fantasist. It was meant to be used, real captains, real crews, real cargo and cannon riding on the accuracy of these lines. Now the 1929 rediscovery. Picture the scene a little more closely. The Topkapi Palace had functioned for centuries as the beating heart of Ottoman power, and its archives had absorbed documents from all corners of the empire, layered on top of each other, forgotten, misfiled, buried under bureaucracy and time. When the palace was being catalogued as part of a broader modernization effort in the new Turkish Republic, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was working through the collection and came across this parchment. Drawn on gazelle skin, folded and worn, torn at the edges. What survived wasn't a complete world map. It was a fragment, roughly 1/3 of what Piri Reis had originally created, based on his own written notes describing a much larger document. That detail alone deserves attention, because a huge amount of the modern mystique around this map depends on people forgetting or never knowing that most of it is simply gone. We don't have the whole picture, we have a torn corner of it. So what does that surviving corner actually show? Clearly and uncontroversially, it depicts the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a scattering of Atlantic islands, along with parts of the Iberian Peninsula. These sections are recognizable, reasonably proportioned, and consistent with what a well-informed Mediterranean cartographer working from Columbus-era sources could plausibly produce. Nobody seriously disputes that part. Where things get messy is down at the bottom edge of the fragment, where the coastline curves and bends in a way that some researchers and a lot of internet enthusiasts have interpreted as a landmass sweeping east to west along the bottom of the map. That curling coastline is the entire foundation of the Antarctica claim. It's a few inches of drawn line on old leather, and it has launched 1,000 documentaries. Before we get pulled into that argument, though, there's an important distinction worth making, because Piri Reis didn't just produce this one map. His far more famous and far more influential work, at least among actual historians of navigation, was something called the Kitab Bibahriye, the Book of Navigation. This was a massive compilation of sailing directions, coastal descriptions, and detailed charts covering the Mediterranean, packed with practical information for captains navigating ports, harbours, currents and hazards. It's genuinely one of the great achievements of Ottoman maritime science, and it's the reason Piri Reis is still respected in naval history circles today. The 1513 world map, the one everyone talks about, wasn't part of that. It was a separate, earlier project, an ambitious attempt to compile a comprehensive world chart using multiple sources, some of them explicitly credited by Piri Reis himself. And that detail is going to matter a lot in a few minutes. Because before we can ask whether this map shows something impossible, we need to understand something more basic. How maps like this actually got made in the first place, and just how much guesswork, borrowing and outright copying was baked into the process from the very start. To get into the head of Piri Reis, you have to put yourself on the deck of a 16th century ship, because maps in this era weren't drawn from some god's eye view. They were distilled from experience, from weeks and months and years of human beings getting lost, getting lucky, and sometimes not coming back at all. What did a navigator actually have? First, the magnetic compass. Not a precision instrument, just a needle floating or pivoting so it could point roughly north. It told you direction, not position. Then there was the log line, a weighted piece of wood tied to a rope knotted at regular intervals, tossed over the stern to measure speed. Sailors counted how many knots slipped through their fingers in a given time. That's where the term knots as a speed unit comes from. Combine direction from the compass, speed from the log line, and time from hourglasses, and you get the backbone of 1500s navigation, dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is brutally simple. You start from a known point. You think you know your heading, you think you know your speed. You track how long you've been going that way, and you plot a new point on the chart. Then you repeat, and repeat, and repeat. Every little error in speed, direction, or timing quietly piles up. A 1-degree mistake in heading doesn't sound like much. Stretch it across 1,000 miles of open water, and you're nowhere near where you think you are. On top of that, latitude was just starting to become something sailors could estimate reliably. In the Northern Hemisphere, they could sight Polaris, the North Star, with a cross staff or an astrolabe, and get a rough measure of how far north or south they were. In the south, they relied on the Southern Cross and other constellations, but the geometry was trickier. Cloud cover ruined observations. A rolling deck made precise angles a fantasy. And longitude, there was no good way to measure it at all. You could guess from sailing time, but that just threw you back into the swamp of dead reckoning. That's the world Piri Reis was working in. No GPS, no satellites, not even an accurate clock. Just magnetism, rope, sand in a glass, and the collective memory of people who'd tried not to die at sea. Now, out of that chaos, something remarkable had already emerged by his time: Portolan charts. Portolan charts were the workhorses of Mediterranean navigation from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. They look strange to modern eyes, coastlines spider-webbed with radiating lines, like someone dropped a handful of straight edges on the page and traced them all. Those lines are rum lines, showing constant compass bearings between key points. How are these charts made? Not from lofty theory. From pilots' reports from this cape, you sail on a bearing of northeast by east for so many miles until you hit that island. From that island, turn due east until the harbour mouth appears. Piece by piece, leg by leg, these sailing directions were plotted and stitched together. The result was that coastlines, especially heavily travelled ones, could be shockingly good. Bays, headlands, inlets, islands, dangerous shoals close to shore. These were encountered and re-encountered over and over. Errors got noticed. If a chart showed a rock that didn't exist, people complained. If it missed a reef that tore open hulls, that chart got corrected or tossed. But notice what's being tested here: the edge between sea and land. The coastline, the moment you go inland, that corrective feedback collapses. A sailor doesn't see mountain ranges 100 kilometres from shore. He might hear about them from a merchant who heard it from a camel driver, who heard it from someone else entirely. So, medieval and early modern charts could nail the outline of a bay while stuffing the interior with castles, cities and rivers placed by rumour, tradition or pure aesthetic balance. This split, crisp coastlines, speculative interiors is baked into the DNA of maps, like Piri Reis's. Now add another layer of complexity. A world map in 1513 was essentially a massive collage. No one person had sailed every ocean. Instead, cartographers assembled their charts from multiple sources. Portolan charts from Italian and Catalan pilots, new transatlantic routes from Spanish and Portuguese voyages, older Mappe Mundi with their theological geography, and classical authorities like Ptolemy, whose ideas about latitude and longitude still hovered over European cartography. These sources didn't agree. They used different scales. They assumed different shapes for the Earth, different ways of projecting a curved surface onto a flat page. A Portolan chart treated the Mediterranean like a slightly distorted rectangle. Ptolemaic maps wrapped the world in a gridded mathematical framework. Early Atlantic charts stretched or compressed coastlines to fit whatever piece of parchment happened to be in front of the mapmaker. When someone like Piri Reis sat down to draw a world map, he had to make choices. How do you glue a Portuguese chart of Brazil onto an Italian chart of the Atlantic? Where exactly do you attach this newly reported coastline to the older, trusted shape of Africa? Do you rotate a segment a few degrees to make it match the next one? Do you stretch a bay, shrink a gulf, bend a cape so the lines connect? These weren't abstract questions. They were physical actions with ink and knife and compass, trimming, redrawing, rescaling. The more fragments you tried to stitch together, the more you had to fudge. Modern cartographers talk about projections and equations. Piri Reis was solving the same kinds of problems with judgment calls and experience. And over all of this hovered the long, messy chain of copying. Charts were precious. They were closely guarded state and commercial secrets, but they were also perishable. Parchment wears out, ink fades. So sailors, scribes, and cartographers copied charts by hand again and again. Every copy was an opportunity for error. A small bay might be rounded off. A cape might drift a few millimeters on the page, which at map scale could mean dozens of miles. A note scribbled in the margin of one chart might be misread as a coastline on the next. Copying also amplified bias. If one influential chartmaker misplaced an island, that island could propagate through generations of maps, its existence reinforced simply by repetition. Later cartographers trusted earlier authorities, so they kept the island, maybe shifted it a bit, maybe changed its shape, but rarely dared to delete it outright. Phantom geography accumulated like sediment. All of this matters for how we talk about accuracy. In 1513, accuracy didn't mean every latitude and longitude matching a satellite image. It meant something much more practical. Could a captain use this chart to get from port A to port B without hitting unmarked rocks or missing land entirely? Was the relative position of coasts, harbours and landmarks good enough that an experienced pilot could interpret and correct for its quirks? By that standard, many early 16th century charts were impressively accurate for the sea lanes they covered. But step away from those lanes, out into empty ocean, down into the deep south, or across the unvisited interiors, and you're no longer looking at measured reality. You're looking at estimates, best guesses, and sometimes pure cartographic imagination. So when we stare at that strange curling coastline on the Piri Reis map and ask whether it shows an ice-free Antarctica, we have to remember the toolkit and the process behind it. A world built from dead reckoning and Portolan fragments. A map assembled from mismatched pieces, copied and recopied, with errors drifting and mutating like genes through generations of charts. The question isn't just, does this line look like Antarctica to us? It's, what would it have meant to someone drawing it in 1513, with the instruments, habits, and constraints of their time? If the Piri Reis map were just a mysterious coastline with no explanation, it would still be interesting. But it would also be easy to project anything we wanted onto it. Aliens, Atlanteans, secret ancient sailors, you name it. What makes this particular map different is that Piri Reis actually told us where he got his information. He wrote on the map, a lot, across the surviving fragment. You can see these little blocks of Ottoman Turkish text, like sticky notes scattered along the coasts. They're not decoration, they're commentary, and some of them read almost like a bibliography. In one famous inscription, Piri says that he did not map the western regions from his own voyages alone. Instead, he says he used about 20 charts and maps as sources. Some of these, he tells us, were new Portuguese charts. Others were Arab maps, and crucially he mentions a chart that he attributes to a Genoese infidel known as Columbus. In other words, he's telling the user of the map, This isn't just my personal guesswork. This is a synthesis of the best available intelligence, gathered from the leading maritime powers and traditions of his day. That claim about Portuguese charts makes sense. By 1513, the Portuguese had been pushing down the coast of Africa for decades. They'd rounded the Cape of Good Hope. They were in the Indian Ocean. They had made it to Brazil. Their pilots and cartographers were producing some of the most advanced nautical charts on Earth, and the Ottoman Navy, Piri's world, had every incentive to get hold of copies. We know from other records that captured charts did circulate. Ships were taken as prizes, pilots defected, information leaked. So when Piri says in one note that a piece of coastline comes from the charts of the Portuguese infidels, that's not some wild boast. It fits what we know about how naval intelligence moved around the early 16th century Mediterranean. The references to Arab maps point to another layer. Islamic geographers had been mapping the world for centuries before Piri Reis, drawing on Greek sources like Ptolemy, Persian geographical works and first-hand observations from merchants and pilgrims moving across the Indian Ocean and overland into Central Asia and Africa. Their tradition emphasized different routes, different centers, different priorities than European charts. But it was deep, by citing Arab sources alongside Portuguese ones. Piri is advertising himself as someone who can straddle both worlds, the older scholarly geography of the Islamic world and the cutting-edge nautical intelligence of the Atlantic powers. Then there's Columbus. In one of the map notes, Piri claims that a portion of the western lands was drawn from a chart made by Columbus. He even adds a little narrative that 8 years before he drew his map, a Spanish ship was captured by his uncle, Piri Reis, and that among the prize was a chart that had originally been used by Columbus on his voyages. If true, that would be remarkable. Columbus's own working charts have not survived. Historians have to reconstruct his mental map from letters, reports, and later depictions. A genuine derivative copy embedded in the Piri Reis map would be a tantalizing window into what Columbus thought the New World looked like. But here is where we have to be careful. Can we verify that what Piri had was actually a Columbus chart? Not directly. We only have his word for it, written a decade later, in a highly competitive environment where cartographers and navigators had strong incentives to name-drop impressive sources. Historians are divided. Some see the general shape and placement of the Caribbean on the Piri Reis map and argue that it does look like something that could have descended from early Spanish or Columbus-era prototypes. Others point out that by 1513 there were already multiple Spanish and Portuguese charts of the Caribbean floating around. A chart, once used by Columbus, could just as easily mean a Spanish chart from the post-Columbus era, with the admiral's name attached to increase its prestige. And prestige mattered. In this period, cartographers weren't just drawing pictures of the world. They were staking reputations, bidding for patronage, offering tools of war and commerce to powerful rulers. A map was a claim to authority. So when you wrote on your chart, that part of it came from the chart of Columbus or the excellent map of the Portuguese, you were doing the 16th century equivalent of citing top experts and best-selling authors. The more ancient or exotic the lineage of your sources sounded, the more weight your map carried. Which brings us to the truly slippery phrases, the ones where Piri says that some material comes from maps, from the time of Alexander, or from earlier ancient charts. Those scattered references have been catnip for people who want the Piri Reis map to be a relic of some forgotten technical civilization. If Piri is literally copying a chain of charts that goes back to Alexander the Great, the argument goes, maybe those charts preserved even older knowledge of an ice-free Antarctica, say, or of coastlines explored tens of thousands of years ago. But in the rhetorical world Piri lived in Invoking Alexander doesn't necessarily mean he had a physical piece of parchment from 300 BCE sitting on his table. Alexander, in Islamic and Mediterranean lore, was a culture hero, a world conqueror, a symbol of antiquity and universal rule. Saying, "This goes back to Alexander's time," can be more like saying, "This tradition is very old and venerable," than "This is literally a 1,800-year-old technical drawing." Medieval and early modern writers did this constantly. They anchored knowledge in the distant past to give it authority, even when the actual chain of copies and revisions was long, messy, and mostly invisible. It's entirely possible that Piri had access to maps whose designs ultimately derived in a loose sense from late classical or early Islamic reworkings of Ptolemaic geography, which themselves like to gesture back to Alexander's era. But between Ptolemy, Arab intermediaries, Portolan chart traditions and practical corrections by countless unnamed pilots, whatever those originals looked like would have been heavily transformed. So when we read, "From the time of Alexander" on the Piri Reis map, we shouldn't immediately jump to, "Here is literal proof of ultra-ancient surveyors mapping an ice-free Antarctica." We should read it as part of a strategy, Piri stacking up impressive names and deep lineages to make his map sound as authoritative as possible. And that brings us to a crucial point that often gets overlooked in the hype. In all the surviving inscriptions on the fragment we have, Piri never says, "This is a map of a great southern continent discovered in ancient times." He doesn't say, "Here is a land beyond the ice," or "Here is a continent at the bottom of the world, charted by a lost race." When he comments on the southern extension of the landmass, his notes talk about winds, about strange animals, about how many days' sail it is between certain points, typical pilot information. They fit into the same framework as his other coastal annotations. The southern coastline is presented as just that, coastline. More land continuing south from known coasts, not a separate, explicitly named Antarctica. In other words, the map's own text does a few clear things and notably doesn't do others. It clearly tells us that Piri was compiling from contemporary Portuguese and Spanish material, from Arab maps, and from what he believed or wanted his readers to believe were older, prestigious sources stretching back into classical antiquity. It clearly shows him engaging in name-dropping and deep history rhetoric to bolster the legitimacy of his work. What it does not clearly do is claim, in so many words, to depict a distinct, anciently known southern continent free of ice. That idea, the stunning, viral idea that this is Antarctica without its ice cap, comes later from modern interpreters reading backwards into those lines and into that enigmatic southern coast. To evaluate that claim, we have to zoom in on that coastline itself and ask what else it might be showing if we take Piri's own stated sources seriously. The modern obsession with Antarctica on the Piri Reis map doesn't start in 1513. It doesn't even start in the Age of Sail. It really gets going in the 20th century, long after the map had been drawn, stored, forgotten, and then rediscovered. When the fragment turned up in the Topkapi Palace in 1929, scholars were fascinated, but for very different reasons than YouTube thumbnails are today. Here was a rare early 16th century world map, in colour, by a named Ottoman admiral showing the New World only 2 decades after Columbus. That was the headline. South America's shape, the Caribbean islands, the blending of Islamic and European sources, this was catnip for historians of cartography. The southern coastline, at first it was mostly treated as a curiosity. Maybe an overextended South America, maybe a guess at some southern landmass, in line with the old idea of a balancing continent below. But it wasn't front-page weird yet. The shift happens when modern commentators begin to look at that southern edge, not as more of South America, but as something else entirely, Antarctica. Once you make that interpretive leap, The map is no longer just an impressive 16th century synthesis. It becomes a possible crack in our entire timeline of exploration. The crucial accelerant here wasn't an academic paper. It was popular writing. In the mid-20th century, a few writers started to suggest that the southern land on Piri's map looked like the northern coastline of Antarctica. Not Antarctica as we see it on a globe, huge, roundish, sitting at the pole, but Antarctica peeled back, stretched and rotated into an early modern map projection. Then, in the 1960s, the idea got a champion who would supercharge it. Charles Hapgood. Hapgood wasn't a crank in the sense of being uneducated. He was a college professor who took maps seriously. But he was also convinced that the Earth's crust had slipped in the relatively recent past, moving entire continents into new positions. To make that wild geophysical theory work, he needed evidence that people had mapped Antarctica when it was in a milder latitude and not buried under 2 kilometers of ice. Enter Piri Reis. Hapgood and others took detailed tracings of the Piri map's southern coast and tried to overlay them on modern reconstructions of Antarctica's bedrock coastlines, the shape of the land under the ice, revealed by seismic and radar surveys. With enough stretching, rotating and forgiving of errors, they argued, you could get a match. From there, the narrative practically wrote itself. If a 1513 map contained, embedded in its sources, a coast that only modern science could properly recognise, then surely Piri must have been copying something very ancient. Something produced by a civilization capable of mapping Antarctica before it froze, or at least before Europeans discovered it. This is where the confusion starts to multiply, because several different claims get folded together as if they're one. The first, weaker claim is, the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica. In this version, you don't necessarily say anything about ice. You just argue that the southern landmass isn't South America extended too far, or some generic southern continent. It's the Antarctic Peninsula, misplotted. The second, much stronger claim is, the Piri Reis map shows an ice-free Antarctic coastline. Here, you're not just matching the exposed coasts that ships can see today. You're saying the map somehow captures the contours of land that lies now under hundreds of meters of ice, implying that whoever first mapped it did so before the ice sheets formed, or with survey capabilities far beyond early modern tech. Those are very different levels of extraordinary. The first one, maybe he accidentally drew Antarctica, is already a stretch, given that nobody we know of reached Antarctica's shores before the 19th century, and given how common hypothetical southern continents were in 1500s cosmology. But it's at least in the realm of weird but conceivable navigational error or odd projection. The second claim demands something else entirely. To be credible, it needs hard evidence on multiple fronts at once. You would need at minimum clear, reproducible geometric correspondence between the Piri coastline and modern reconstructions of Antarctica's sub-ice shorelines. Not just if you squint it sort of lines up. That means rigorous, quantitative matching across different projections, not hand-drawn overlays chosen by eye. Independent historical evidence that someone at some point before the modern age had either been to an ice-free Antarctic coast or had surveying methods capable of inferring what lay under existing ice sheets. Ships, logbooks, written descriptions, other maps from entirely different traditions pointing to the same thing. A plausible dating of that supposed ancient source to a time when Antarctica was actually less ice-covered than today. That's not a small ask, because glaciology, ice core data and climate models all point to Antarctica being heavily glaciated for hundreds of thousands of years at least, and in many regions for millions, a coherent transmission story for the map itself. If this information survived from some deep past, how did it get copied, recopied, translated, and eventually end up in the hands of Portuguese or Arab cartographers without leaving clearer fingerprints in other documents? And finally, you'd need to rule out simpler explanations, that the coastline is a distorted extension of South America, that projection warping creates illusory matches, that copyists merged or misaligned sources, or that later interpreters are forcing the data to fit a desired pattern. Without all of that, the jump from ambiguous southern coast to ancient ice-free Antarctica isn't just a bold hypothesis. It's a chain of leaps, each one assuming the previous leap was correct. Once Hapgood's version of that story was in print, it spread far beyond specialist circles. The map left the archives and entered paperback lore, TV specials, and later the internet. Each retelling tended to smooth out the uncertainties and emphasize the drama. Not some argue this might correlate with Antarctica, but this map shows Antarctica before the ice. By the time it hit fringe archaeology books and late-night documentaries, the two separate claims, Antarctica and ice-free Antarctica, had fused into one big, cinematic assertion. Here is visual proof of a lost high-tech civilization. To assess whether that holds up, we have to go back to the map itself, strip away a century of hype, and look carefully at that southern coast. Does it really need Antarctica to explain it? Or is there a more grounded reading that fits better with what Piri tells us about his sources and with what we know of 16th century geography? To answer that, we need to zoom in on the shape of the coastline, compare it to South America, to early ideas of a southern continent, and to the real Antarctic shore, and see which story fits with the few hard facts we actually have. If you run your finger along the surviving fragment of the Piri Reis map, starting around Brazil and moving south, the first thing you notice is that nothing suddenly jumps into being Antarctica. The coastline just keeps going. You get the bulge of Brazil, then a turn inward that roughly tracks the real concavity of the South American coast. Then the land bends out again, hooks and continues curving southeast. There are inlets, capes, little bays. It looks like a mariner's coastline, detailed where ships hugged the shore, vague where nobody bothered, filled with names and notes in Ottoman Turkish. The disputed part isn't a separate island plopped down in the ocean. It's a continuation of that same drawn landmass. On the parchment, this southern stretch is attached to South America. So why did some people decide this was something other than more South America? Because if we overlay our modern globe in our minds, that coastline goes too far. It seems to swing eastward and southward beyond where Patagonia actually lies. And if you're looking for Antarctica, that's exactly the kind of extra coast you might be tempted to recruit. But there's a much more mundane explanation that historians of cartography point to. Early mapmakers routinely drew South America too long, too far south, and too far east. In the early 1500s, nobody had sailed cleanly around the tip of the continent, and then very precisely measured longitude and latitude all the way. They had bits and pieces, Portuguese charts of Brazil and the northeast coast, Spanish knowledge trickling up from voyages in the south, rumours of straits and capes. Long stretches of the southern Atlantic were essentially educated guesswork. When you stitch all that together on a single sheet, you run into two big problems. First, projection. To turn a curved Earth into a flat map, you have to choose how to squash, stretch, and rotate reality. Piri's map is almost certainly based on Portolan chart techniques, and some form of older projection, not a neat modern Mercator grid. Distances along coasts, bearings from compass roses, and pilot book directions have to be reconciled on a plane. Errors accumulate. A coastline that should trend southwest might tilt more east-west on the page. A cape that belongs under the continent might slide east of it. Second, compilation. Piri explicitly tells us in his marginal notes that he drew on about 20 charts and mappe mundi from different traditions, Arabic, Portuguese, even what he believed to be charts descended from Columbus. Each of those sources had its own internal logic, its own projection, its own distortions. When you try to merge several partial coastlines, maybe one detailed chart of Brazil, another of the river plate, another that sketches some southern lands whose exact position nobody is sure of, you don't just get a clean composite. You get seams. Those seams can easily turn into phantom geography. Imagine you have two separate coastal profiles, A and B. A ends with a big bay and a cape trending southeast. B begins with a similar cape trending southeast, then curling east. You suspect they're parts of the same landmass, but you're not entirely sure where to splice them. If you line them up a little bit off, you might extend the coastline further south and east than it really runs. On the finished map, it looks like one long continuous shore. To us, it looks like a mystery extension that demands explanation. That's essentially the South America extended too far east-south hypothesis. It isn't exotic, and it isn't unique to Piri Reis. You see versions of this on many early 16th century maps. South America pulled like taffy toward the pole, its tail drifting east into what we now know is empty ocean. When you compare Piri's southern outline to real South American features, the match is decent at first and gets worse the farther south you go. The bulge around Brazil? Reasonable. The inward curve toward the Rio de la Plata? You can squint and see it. But as you move into what ought to be Patagonia, the correspondence starts to fray. The real Patagonian coast runs roughly north-south, with a fairly straight Atlantic side before you get to the complex maze of channels around Tierra del Fuego. Piri's version, by contrast, snakes and bends, with peninsulas and deep embayments that don't line up cleanly with known Patagonian geography. Some bays on the map look exaggerated, others misplaced. The supposed hook people point to as an Antarctic peninsula analogue can just as easily be read as a misplotted cape or the result of rotating one source chart relative to another when Piri was copying. In other words, the more you zoom in, the less that southern coast behaves like a precise record of any real singular shoreline. It behaves like what it almost certainly is, a synthesis. A fusion of multiple reports, some accurate, some speculative, all squeezed into a projection system that wasn't designed for global mapping in the first place. And there's another layer on top of that. By 1513, Piri wasn't working in a vacuum of pure empiricism. He, like his European contemporaries, would have been familiar with an old philosophical and cosmographical idea. The world needed a great southern continent to balance the lands in the north. This wasn't called Antarctica yet. It was Terra Australis, or related concepts in Islamic geographical traditions. A hypothetical, not yet seen landmass that was thought to exist somewhere in the far south. You can see this belief all over Renaissance maps, big blobs of land painted along the bottom edge of the world, with vague coasts and imaginative labels. Nobody had to have sailed there. The continent existed first as an idea. Now, put yourself in Piri's position. You have concrete coastal information down to some uncertain latitude. You also have a cosmological expectation that there is more land to the south. When your sources don't quite agree or leave gaps, it's very easy for South America, at the bottom of the chart, to start shading into some southern land in your mind. That doesn't mean Piri sat there drawing a deliberate Terra Australis across the whole bottom of his map. But it does mean that the conceptual presence of a southern continent was in the air. It would have influenced how far he felt comfortable extending coastlines, how willing he was to join a rumoured southern shore to the known New World, and how he filled in areas where his sources were silent. So when we look at that ambiguous southern fringe and ask, is this South America, Patagonia, or something else? The most grounded answer is, it's mostly South America, pulled, warped, and stitched until the fit with reality starts to break. Where that fit fails, what creeps in is not secret knowledge of Antarctica, but an older, powerful idea, the ghost of Terra Australis beginning to take shape at the edge of the known world. To understand why that ghost of a southern continent was so persuasive, you have to rewind long before caravels and compasses, back to a world where map and cosmology were basically the same thing. In classical antiquity, philosophers weren't just sketching coastlines. They were trying to build a balanced universe. Think of people like Parmenides, Aristotle, later Ptolemy. They inherited a round earth and a passion for symmetry. If there were great land masses in the north, Europe, Asia, the known parts of Africa, then, the reasoning went, there must be something to counterweight them in the south. Nature, in their view, didn't like asymmetry. Aristotle flat out says this. He suggests that between the tropics and the Antarctic Circle there are inhabited regions. But beyond that, in the far south, there might be lands separated from us by an impassable torrid zone. Later commentators turn this into a more explicit idea, a great southern land, unknown to us, but necessary for the Earth's equilibrium. It wasn't evidence-based geography, it was philosophical physics. Medieval scholars picked this up and folded it into Christian and Islamic cosmology. In the Latin West you get Mappe Mundi, where the inhabited world is a kind of island, surrounded by ocean, and somewhere off the edge, or under the equator, lurk antipodes and hypothetical southern peoples. In the Islamic world, geographers like Al-Idrisi map the known old world with impressive accuracy, but even they often leave the far south as a blank, or hint at lands beyond the navigable zones. Nobody had seen this southern continent, but for centuries, educated people were comfortable with the idea that it ought to exist. Then the age of discovery happens, and suddenly the bottom edge of the map starts filling up with real coastlines. Portuguese ships push down the coast of Africa, round the Cape, and move into the Indian Ocean. Spanish and Portuguese voyages sketch out Brazil. Magellan's expedition finally, painfully, fights its way through the strait at the tip of South America in 1520-21 and proves there is an entire ocean beyond. Every time a new southern coastline appears, it hits that old philosophical expectation like a tuning fork. Is this the edge of the great southern land? Is this Africa sticking down? Is this Asia's southern extension? Or are we finally glimpsing Terra Australis? You can track the evolution of this ghost continent by just looking at maps across the 15th and 16th centuries. On some early Portolan charts, you see tentative southern promontories, a cape here, a bulge there, little scraps floating in otherwise empty seas. By the mid-1500s, after Magellan, you start getting bolder statements. Mapmakers like Oronce Finé in 1531 draw a massive continuous southern continent wrapping around the bottom of the world, its northern edge touching or almost touching South America. Finé labels it with confidence, Terra Australis, not a lonely island, a world continent. Other cartographers follow suit. Mercator's great when 569 World Map shows a vast southern land. So does Ortelius in 1570. They don't agree on the exact shape, but they agree on the premise. There is something big down there. And crucially, this thing is allowed to bleed into the known coasts. South America isn't a clean, isolated unit sitting nicely on our modern grid. Its southern tip on many maps either merges with or almost grazes Terra Australis. Narrow straits are drawn or left deliberately vague, between Patagonia and some imagined southern shore. The line between this is still South America and this is the new southern continent gets very blurry, very fast. That blur is where speculation becomes tradition. Cartographers in the 1500s and 1600s weren't pulling every coastline from ship logs. They were also copying each other a lot. If a respected cosmographer in Venice or Antwerp decided to draw a big southern land with a certain curve, that curve didn't just stay on his sheet. It got lifted, traced, modified, recopied into atlases, wall maps, pocket globes. Apprentice mapmakers learned by imitating master maps. Printers reused copper plates with minor tweaks. Decorative elements and geographic outlines alike became part of a shared visual language. So even if a given mapmaker personally had zero direct information about any land beyond, say 40 degrees south, he would still feel almost obligated to show something there. Not because he'd been to Terra Australis, but because respectable world maps had Terra Australis. Leaving the bottom edge blank looked ignorant. The imagined continent hardened into a cartographic habit. This is where it's important to separate Terra Australis from Antarctica in our minds. Antarctica, as we use the term today, is a real physical continent, ice-covered, centred on the South Pole with a very particular outline. It has a distinct peninsula, specific bays and inlets, and it's ringed by the Southern Ocean. Terra Australis, as Renaissance mapmakers thought about it, was none of that. It wasn't mapped from coasts inward. It was drawn from the idea outward. It didn't have a fixed shape or exact latitude. Sometimes it hugged the pole, other times it sprawled up toward the mid-latitudes, sending tongues of land into the Indian Ocean, or pushing north to almost brush New Guinea. On some maps it had rivers and cities sketched in, entirely invented. It was essentially a conceptual placeholder. Here be the land we know must be there, once we finally see it. That means when you look at an early 16th century map and see a southern coastline that seems too far south or too long or curling toward where Antarctica would be, you don't immediately need a story about secret polar expeditions. You just need to remember that mapmakers had two overlapping impulses: follow their sources and satisfy the expectation of a balancing southern land. If your real information about South America peters out in a mess of rumours and half-charted bays, but your mental model of the world says more land should exist down there, it's very easy to do exactly what we see on Piri's map and many others. You extend a known coast a bit further. You let it curve more. You hesitate to cut it off abruptly. Maybe you link a vague report of a southern shore to the end of your South American outline. Maybe you borrow a curve from another map that already hints at a southern continent and splice it on. No conspiracy required, just the ordinary inertia of ideas. Over time, that inertia makes the southern coast feel real. The more maps show it, the more natural it seems. Pilots' rutters might start mentioning lands glimpsed vaguely in fog, or misplotted islands in the south, and those become retrofitted as confirmation. The feedback loop tightens. Idea shapes map, map reinforces idea. So when someone later comes along and says, "Look, this 1513 map shows a southern land right where Antarctica should be," they're bumping into that tradition midstream. They're seeing the accumulated weight of centuries of Terra Australis thinking, plus the practical distortions of early Atlantic mapping, and reading them as evidence of direct exploration. But in context, what we're most likely looking at is the opposite: a coastline that exists precisely because nobody had actually been far enough south to disprove it. The phantom continent haunted the bottom of the page long before a human eye ever saw the ice. So if Terra Australis was largely an idea, not an observation, we still have to face the uncomfortable question the Piri Reis map keeps poking at. Could someone, somehow, have actually reached Antarctica early? To answer that, you have to zoom way out and look at the boring, well-documented part of the story first. The part historians actually agree on. The first definite sightings of anything Antarctic happened very late. In 1772-75, James Cook circles the globe in high southern latitudes. He crosses the Antarctic Circle 3 times. He fights through fog, storms, and what he calls ice islands, massive tabular icebergs. At one point he gets within about 80 miles of the Antarctic coast. But he never sees land. He comes back convinced there might be some southern continent, sure, but if it exists, he says, it lies condemned to everlasting rigour of frost and ice. That's the 1770s. 2.5 centuries after Piri Reis. Over the next few decades, sealing and whaling ships start pushing south, mostly because they're chasing money, not glory. Fur seals and whales mean oil, skins, profit. These are hard men in small wooden ships, running enormous risks for a cargo. In 1820, you finally get the first confirmed recorded sightings of the Antarctic mainland. And even that's messy. A Russian expedition under Fabian von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev logs seeing an ice shelf and what they interpret as land behind it in January 1820. Almost simultaneously, a British sealer, Edward Bransfield, charts part of the Antarctic peninsula. A few months later, an American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer also reaches the peninsula. They're not planting flags on green shores, they're edging along vicious pack ice, scribbling jagged coastlines under clouds and snow squalls, usually from a distance. But this is where the historical consensus puts the beginning of real Antarctic exploration. The 19th century, with multiple independent logs, coordinates, charts, and later follow-up voyages that confirm what those first crews saw. Before that, you mostly have silence. So, does that mean nobody ever got there earlier? Not necessarily. There's a huge difference between nobody could have, and we have no solid evidence that anyone did. Technically, pre-modern ships could reach very high southern latitudes. Cook proves that with 18th century technology, Portuguese caravels in the 1500s were capable of crossing entire oceans. Sealing vessels in the 17th and 18th centuries were already poking into the roaring 40s and furious 50s. Those harsh wind belts in the southern oceans. And weather is chaos. A storm can shove even a cautious captain off course. A ship hunting seals around South Georgia or the Falklands or rounding Cape Horn in bad weather could get pushed further south than intended. If you imagine that happening centuries earlier, it's not impossible to picture a small crew glimpsing an enormous wall of ice on the horizon, or a distant snow-covered coast, and then fighting their way back north with a story about a terrible land of ice at the bottom of the world. Historically, you can sketch 3 main maybe scenarios people bring up. First, storm-driven drift. A vessel in the South Atlantic, maybe Portuguese, Spanish, or later Dutch, gets caught in a massive system and driven far south of its planned latitude. The crew doesn't mean to explore. They're just trying not to die. They see ice, maybe even land behind the ice, survive by sheer luck, and limp back with a tale that ends up as a vague note in a pilot's rudder. To the far south lie dangerous seas and ice. Second, deliberate but undocumented routes tied to sealing or whaling. We know later sealers were extremely secretive about their hunting grounds. If you discover an unexploited rookery full of animals you can turn into cash, you don't publish a cheerful map. You keep your mouth shut. It's conceivable that some very early commercial voyages reached sub-Antarctic islands, or even ice-choked coastal zones and then buried that information in company archives or private notebooks that never made it into official history. Third, one-off encounters by ships that didn't survive. A wreck leaves no log. If a Spanish galleon in 1580 strays south and founders against pack ice, every direct record goes down with it. All you get is maybe a rumour. A ship was lost in southern storms and nothing more. All of these are physically possible. None of them currently have the kind of evidence historians would need to say, yes, this happened, and here is where, and here is what they saw. If someone had reached Antarctica early in a way that actually mattered for map-making, you'd expect at least some of the following. Ship logs with clear latitudes and descriptions of continuous land or massive ice shelves persisting across multiple days. Not just we saw some icebergs, but we sailed along a coast trending southwest for 3 days at roughly 65 degrees south. Multiple independent references that line up. A Portuguese log, say, and then 50 years later a Spanish pilot's manual citing that same mysterious southern coast with similar bearings. Names that recur, landmarks that match, cartographic echoes that stabilize. Not just one weird squiggle on one map, but a repeatable outline of a southern land that shows up, with similar shape and latitude, on charts from different traditions, Iberian, Dutch, English, over time. Archaeological traces if we're talking actual landfall. Even a brief landing leaves junk, broken barrels, nails, bits of rope, maybe a campsite. In the Arctic, we found traces of Norse voyages, whaling stations, even the remains of stranded expeditions. In Antarctica, outside of the documented modern era, we don't have pre-19th century European artifacts turning up on the beaches or in the ice. What we actually see is almost the opposite. We see a long gap where no one even claims in surviving documents to have found a continuous southern continent. We see wildly different guesses about Terra Australis from map to map, with no converging stable outline that suggests sustained observation. We see intense secrecy around profitable southern resources like seals, but no smoking gun rudder that says, below 60 degrees south lies a vast land. And we see that when the documented Antarctic sightings finally do happen, in 1820 and after, they come with the whole package: measured positions, multiple ships in the area, follow-up expeditions that confirm and extend the coasts, then international awareness. They behave exactly like the first true discovery of a new continent, not like the rediscovery of something mariners had quietly known for 300 years. That's why historians stay cautious. They're not saying early visits were impossible. The ocean is big and history is full of lost voyages, but without logs, without artifacts, without a consistent cartographic trail that can't be explained by Terra Australis speculation, there's no solid reason to move the discovery of Antarctica centuries back in time. And that brings us right back to the Piri Reis map. Because if we didn't have those earlier, well-documented Antarctic voyages, and we were relying only on Piri's southern squiggle, plus the idea that someone must have gone there, we'd be doing exactly what Renaissance cosmographers were doing with Terra Australis, filling a blank with the shape we expect to see. To really understand what's being claimed about the Piri Reis map, we have to tackle the word that keeps getting thrown around in documentaries and fringe books, ice-free. Because ice-free Antarctica can mean radically different things depending on what kind of ice you're talking about. And those differences matter. Start with the simplest distinction: sea ice versus the continental ice sheet. Sea ice is the stuff that forms on the surface of the ocean every winter. It grows, cracks, drifts, melts back, cooks ice islands, the pack ice modern icebreakers ram through, even a lot of those flat-topped bergs you picture. That's seasonal or multi-year sea ice. It hugs the coastline in winter and retreats in summer. Sailors meet it, curse it and write about it. The continental ice sheet is a different beast. That's ice sitting on land, not water, miles thick in places. It's what buries almost all of the rock of Antarctica under a frozen shield. That ice doesn't melt away in summer. It doesn't come and go with storms. It's a permanent fixture on human timescales. When people say the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica ice-free, they're not just saying a ship got close in a warm season and saw a bit of coastline not choked with pack ice. They're saying somehow someone had access to a map of the bedrock coastline, the shape of the continent underneath that massive land ice. That's an extraordinary claim, and you can already see why confusing sea ice with continental ice makes the whole conversation slippery. Any early modern sailor could see seasonal sea ice. Nobody, with wood ships and no radar, could see through 2 kilometers of glacial ice to trace the rock beneath. Now zoom out from sailors to deep time. Modern paleoclimate research gives us a rough timeline for when Antarctica actually froze over. It's not perfect. Ice cores and sediment records are patchy, interpretations change, but the broad strokes are consistent. Antarctica wasn't always a frozen wasteland. Tens of millions of years ago, it was part of a much warmer world. Think forests, not glaciers, around 34 million years ago during the transition between the Eocene and Oligocene epochs. Global climate cooled sharply. Keo levels dropped, ocean circulation changed, and the first large ice sheets started to form on the Antarctic continent. At first, those ice sheets probably waxed and waned, ice advancing, retreating, responding to orbital cycles and greenhouse gas levels. But by something like 15 million years ago, the big picture looks clear. East Antarctica, at least, was locked in as a major ice-covered landmass. West Antarctica may have been more dynamic, with ice sheets growing and shrinking, marine basins flooding and refreezing, but we're still talking millions of years of glaciation, not a warm interlude a few thousand years ago. There were no humans around when Antarctica last had an extensively ice-free interior in the everyday sense of the word. Not farmers, not hunter-gatherers, not even apes that looked much like us. So if someone really had a map that accurately shows the bedrock coastline under today's ice shelves, that map is not just older than Piri Reis. It's older than our species. It's older than the entire genus Homo. You've gone from maybe some forgotten Portuguese voyage straight into aliens or Atlanteans, and that's why serious glaciologists and geologists raise an eyebrow, because the physics of ice and the timeline of Earth's climate don't quietly support a recent, naturally ice-free Antarctica whose coastline could have been charted by Bronze Age sailors and then copied for millennia. It gets even messier when you think about coastlines themselves. Even if, for the sake of argument, you imagine some ancient epoch when Antarctica's ice sheets were drastically smaller, the rock under them wouldn't just pop up in exactly the same shape we'd see today if the ice vanished tomorrow. When you pile thousands of meters of ice on a continent, you're not just freezing the surface. You're pushing the crust down. The Earth's lithosphere literally sags under the weight. Remove that weight, and over thousands of years, the land rebounds upward. Geophysicists call this isostatic rebound. We saw a smaller version of this after the last ice age in places like Scandinavia and Canada. As the big northern ice sheets melted, shorelines shifted. Former seabeds rose, ancient beaches ended up on hillsides. Fjords changed shape. If you tried to match a modern satellite coastline to one from 10,000 years ago without correcting for rebound, you'd get weird near misses and deceptive overlaps. Now scale that up to Antarctica, where the ice is far thicker, and the timescales of glaciation stretch into the tens of millions of years. Any truly ancient ice-free coastline would not be the same outline modern scientists get when they digitally strip away today's ice and run glacial isostatic adjustment models. Edges of the continent, the depth of bays, the shape of peninsulas, all of that would have evolved along with the ice and the crust beneath it. That means coastline matching exercises, taking Piri Reis' squiggly southern edge and warping it until it kind of looks like de-iced Antarctica, are already on shaky ground. You're not just comparing two snapshots of the same thing. You're comparing a hand-drawn 16th century mashup in an unknown projection, with a modern reconstruction of a coastline that has itself changed over deep time. And we haven't even talked about what coastline means in Antarctica right now. Most of what we call the coast of Antarctica on modern maps isn't exposed rock at the ocean's edge. It's ice shelves, floating extensions of the continental ice sheet that project out over the sea. The Ross Ice Shelf, the Filchner Ronne, the Larsen. These aren't land, they're thick, floating slabs of glacial ice, sometimes hundreds of meters thick, attached to land ice behind them, with seawater underneath. Behind the ice shelves and the coastal fringes of the ice sheet, there are rocky mountain ranges and valleys. There are places where, if you magically erase the ice, you'd have fjords and islands and open basins. In other regions, especially in West Antarctica, the bedrock lies below sea level, so remove the ice and you don't get coastline at all. You get a shallow sea flooding far inland. So any hypothetical true ice-free map would have to make a choice. Do you draw the present ice shelf fronts as coasts, the actual rock contact with the ocean under the shelves, the line of the continental shelf off the submerged margins? These are different things. Modern scientific maps distinguish them. Renaissance cartographers, working from rumours and classical theories, did not. All of this stacks up to a simple but uncomfortable conclusion about the ice-free Antarctica claim tied to the Piri Reis map. If ice-free means no seasonal sea ice blocking a glimpse of the shore, that doesn't require any lost civilization. It just requires a ship in a lucky patch of weather, somewhere along the real, already frozen Antarctic margin. But if ice-free means no continental ice sheet, exposed bedrock coastline, matching modern de-iced reconstructions, then you're not just questioning the history of cartography. You're questioning everything we currently understand about Earth's climate over the last 30 million years and how coastlines deform under the weight of ice. And that's a very different level of claim than maybe the Portuguese had a secret voyage. So if an ice-free Antarctica silently demands we rewrite the last 30 million years of Earth history, why do people keep pointing to old maps as if they already did that? This is where it helps to step sideways for a minute and look at a different cartographer. Not a Turkish admiral working off naval charts of the Atlantic, but a French mathematician sitting in Paris, staring at globes and geometry, Oronce Finé. In 1531 and 1532, just a decade after Piri Reis drew his famous world map, Finé published a heart-shaped world projection and then a separate cordiform map of the southern hemisphere. And right there, wrapped around the bottom of the globe like a massive smile, is a gigantic southern landmass, Terra Australis. To a lot of modern eyes, Finé's southern continent looks uncannily like someone tried to sketch Antarctica. You see a bulging landform under Africa and the Indian Ocean, a big sweep under the Pacific, even a sort of hooked nose poking up toward South America. If you squint, you can start tracing familiar shapes. That bump over here looks like Wilkes Land. That inward bite might be the Ross Sea. That curve could almost be the Antarctic Peninsula. And once you start seeing those echoes, it's hard to stop. The human brain hates randomness. It loves patterns. Give it a wiggly coastline and a vague outline of another coastline, and it will happily do the mental Photoshop to make them match. But step back and ask, how did Finé think he knew that land was there? He didn't. Not in the observational sense. No one had sailed around the southern pole and handed him a coastal survey. There was no ancient Greek Google Earth of the Antarctic. Finé was doing what a lot of Renaissance mapmakers did. He was blending reports from new voyages with very old ideas from classical geography and medieval cosmology. Since at least the time of Ptolemy, there had been this powerful notion that the world needed balance. If there were huge lands in the north, there ought to be counterbalancing lands in the south to keep the globe stable. The word Antarctic itself, in its earliest uses, is basically the opposite of the Arctic. A conceptual mirror, not a measured one. So mapmakers started drawing that mirror. They didn't all agree on where it went or what it looked like. That's the interesting part. Early 1500s charts and globes show southern lands in wildly different ways. Some tuck a suggestive promontory directly under South America, as if Patagonia just keeps going. Others smear a vague coastline along the bottom edge of the map with labels like unknown lands, or land seen by no one. Sometimes the southern continent is chopped into two big islands. Sometimes it's a continuous ring, sometimes it fuses with the yet unmapped coasts of Australia. Finé's version is one of the most elaborate. He spells out place names, sketches in mountains, throws in rivers. He links the hypothetical southern land up toward the tip of South America, implying a passage. On later editions, other cartographers copy his shapes, tweak them, rotate them, stretch them to fit different projections. Stand far enough away, and a pattern emerges. The southern continent on 16th century maps is like a Rorschach test for European imagination. Different mapmakers staring at the same blank lower half of the globe, ink in different guesses, guided by the same underlying idea that something should be there. To a modern conspiracy-minded reader, this becomes a smoking gun. Look, they'll say, Piri Reis has a southern land. Oronce Finé has a southern land. Other maps have southern lands. That can't be a coincidence. They all must be drawing from some lost, ultra-ancient master map of an ice-free Antarctica. But once you watch how the sausage is made, that argument gets shakier. You don't need a secret source to explain why 16th century Europeans kept sketching a big southern continent. You just need their books. They were reading Ptolemy, Strabo, Pliny. They were absorbing medieval theological ideas about symmetry and divine order. They were reacting to new Portuguese and Spanish voyages that suddenly showed South America bending southward, Africa tapering toward the Cape, the Indian Ocean opening into the wider world. Put all that together, and the easiest way to finish the globe, without admitting you had no idea what was down there, was to draw a southern counterweight. Finé's maps are a perfect example of how speculative geography can look eerily real in hindsight. You can overlay his Terra Australis on a modern Antarctic projection, wiggle it around, scale it up or down, and find sections that sorta match. You can do the same thing with other maps of the era, each one a different guess. That's not evidence of ancient satellite imagery. That's evidence of how flexible human pattern matching is. And this is why Finé and Piri Reis so often get cited together in documentaries and fringe books. Side by side, they seem to tell a story. Multiple independent witnesses, all hinting at a hidden truth. An ice-free continent remembered across millennia and imperfectly copied. Read them instead as cultural artifacts, and a different picture emerges. Piri Reis is stitching together practical sailing charts, rumours of new coasts, and some older authorities to make a working map for navigators. Oronce Finé is constructing a mathematically elegant world, filling its unknown spaces with the theoretical lands his education tells him ought to exist. Both are products of a moment when Europeans were trying to reconcile exploding new information with inherited cosmologies. In that light, the mystery isn't that they secretly knew too much. It's that they were astonishingly confident sketching in places they absolutely did not know at all. And once you see that confidence, you start questioning a key move in the ancient source map story. The assumption that any coastline that looks detailed must be a copy of something real. Because there's one more twist. When you change the way you project a globe onto a flat surface, you can make almost any elongated squiggle of coast look suspiciously like almost any other. And that's exactly the issue we need to tackle next. If you've ever tried to peel an orange and press the peel flat on a table, you already know the problem. The Earth is a sphere. Maps are flat. Those two facts do not get along nicely. Every time a cartographer turns the curved surface of the planet into ink on parchment, they have to choose what to sacrifice. You can't keep area, shape, distance, and direction all perfectly accurate at once. Something has to bend, stretch, or tear. That bending and stretching is what we call projection. There are hundreds of map projections. Mercator, which inflates Greenland into a supercontinent. Gall-Peters, which preserves relative area but makes everything look stretched. Heart-shaped, cordiform projections like Oronce Finé loved. Polar projections that squish everything around the edges. Each one is a different mathematical spell for flattening a globe. Each one distorts the world in characteristic ways. Now, here's the crucial part. The Piri Reis map is one particular projection, drawn with 16th century assumptions and errors baked in. Modern Antarctica maps are usually shown in totally different projections, often centered on the pole. When people claim the Piri Reis coastline matches an ice-free Antarctic shore, they're almost never comparing like with like. They're taking the orange peel, cutting new slits in it, stretching it out, and then saying, "Look how well it fits this other orange peel I carved up differently." In technical terms, this is called rubber sheeting. Rubber sheeting is what it sounds like. Imagine your map is a sheet of rubber. You grab a few anchor points, maybe the mouth of a river, the tip of a peninsula, the corner of a gulf, and you pin those to match locations on another map. Then you pull, stretch, rotate and scale the rest of the rubber until the anchors line up. If you're careful and honest about it, rubber sheeting can be a legitimate way to compare old charts to modern geography. But if you're determined to get a dramatic match, it's also the easiest way in the world to fool yourself. Because once you're allowed to stretch and rotate freely, a surprising number of coastlines start to look like cousins. You can take the west coast of Africa, flip it, tilt it, and make it hug the outline of eastern South America. You can take a random section of the Canadian Arctic and, with enough warping, prove it's an ancient map of New Zealand. It feels impressive. Look, this bay lines up with that bay, this headland with that headland. But step back and notice what's actually happening. The similarity only appears after you've twisted the map into submission. The trick lives in the control points, the anchors you choose before you start stretching. If I decide that this little bump on Piri Reis must be the Rio de la Plata, and that curve must be the Drake Passage, and this wiggle must be the Ross Sea, then I can lock those 3 or 4 points to a modern Antarctic projection and bend everything in between until it more or less connects. Change my starting assumptions. Decide that bump is actually Tierra del Fuego. That curve is the Strait of Magellan. That wiggle is just meaningless decoration. And suddenly the match evaporates. That's not objective cartography. That's confirmation bias with a ruler. Confirmation bias is your brain's tendency to favour evidence that supports what you already believe. If you walk into the problem convinced that Piri Reis is secretly showing an ice-free Antarctica, you will unconsciously pick the control points that make that story work. You'll discard alignments that don't fit. You'll be generous with how much distortion you allow in places that are inconvenient. And by the end, you'll have a lovingly warped overlay that proves exactly what you expected from the start. So what would a credible geospatial comparison actually look like? First, you'd have to fix the projection problem honestly. You'd either reproject the old map into a mathematically modelled form, or you'd generate a modern coastline in the historical projection the cartographer was probably using. No stretching or shrinking yet, just apples to apples geometry. Second, you'd define your control points in advance, not on the fly. You'd say, we'll use every major cape, river mouth and island that appears clearly on both maps, not just the convenient ones. Third, you'd limit how much distortion you allow. Real coastlines can't compress by 60% in one section and stretch by 300% in another without that counting heavily against the hypothesis. If the only way to make them fit is to turn your rubber sheet into taffy, that's a red flag, not a eureka moment. Fourth, you'd quantify the match. Not kinda feels similar, but actual error measurements. How far off are the supposed corresponding points on average? How much rotation and scaling did you need? If you scramble the labels on a bunch of random coastlines and run the same fitting procedure, how often do you get matches just as good by pure chance? That last step is important. If your method can just as easily prove that the outline of Spain secretly encodes the coast of Madagascar, then your method isn't detecting hidden knowledge. It's detecting how easy it is to force patterns onto squiggly lines. You don't need specialized software to apply some of this skepticism. You can build a quick mental checklist every time you see a dramatic overlay in a documentary or online. Are both maps in the same projection? Or did someone just rotate and resize until it looked right? Did they pick a handful of matching points, or show that most of the coastline lines up without extreme stretching? Do they admit where the fit is bad, or do they quietly crop those bits out of frame? Can they explain in plain language how they decided that this bump equals that peninsula instead of some other feature entirely? And maybe the most telling question, if you handed them a random, unlabeled 16th century coastline and told them it was mysterious, could they resist the urge to make it Antarctica too? Because once you understand projections and rubber sheeting, a lot of "it's a perfect match" claims start to look less like revelations and more like Rorschach tests, ink blots that tell you more about the interpreter than the map. Which brings us to the biggest claim of all, that behind Piri Reis, behind Finé, behind all those speculative southern lands, there lurked a single impossibly ancient master chart. If that's true, it ought to show up not just in warped outlines, but in a whole pattern of evidence. So let's take that idea seriously for a moment, and see how well the ancient source map hypothesis really holds up. Here's the core idea in its most dramatic form. Long before Egypt, long before Sumer, maybe even before the end of the last ice age, there was a civilization that had already done the hard work. They had mapped the world, not just their local river valley or coastline, but the whole planet. They knew the true shape of continents. They could measure latitude and maybe even longitude. They sailed from pole to pole across oceans. We think no one crossed until the age of discovery. Then something happened. Flood, comet, axis tilt, crustal shift, pick your catastrophe. Their cities vanished under rising seas, or were ground to dust by advancing ice. Their monuments crumbled, their writing systems were lost. Their history disappeared, but not everything died. A few fragments survived. Stone pillars with star positions, tablets with distances between ports. Most importantly for our story, a set of master charts. World maps so accurate that when later cultures stumbled across them, they had no idea how such precision was even possible. They copied what they could. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, the scholars of Alexandria, the cartographers of the Islamic Golden Age, medieval monks, early Portuguese pilots, each generation taking a slightly more tattered, slightly more misunderstood version of the original and redrawing it in their own style. By the time we get to the early 1500s, the legend says those ancient charts still existed, buried in royal chart rooms and secret libraries. Piri Reis, gathering 20 charts and mappe mundi, gets his hands on one of the last survivors. He doesn't understand its full projection or math, but he recognizes that its coasts are better, cleaner, more exact than anything his contemporaries can produce. So he does what any pragmatic admiral would do. He copies. On this view, the southern coastline on his map isn't guesswork. It isn't Terra Australis. It isn't South America stretched and mangled by projection. It's a fading echo of something much older, an ice-free Antarctic shore, drawn by people who knew it was there because they'd been there. You can see why this idea is magnetic. It explains apparent anomalies in one stroke. Strange accuracy, ancient source, correct placement of unknown islands. Ancient source. Lines that seem to match under heavy rubber sheeting. Ancient source. Instead of a messy blend of partial reports, misread latitudes and cartographic conventions, you get a clean narrative. Someone, long ago, figured it all out. We're the amnesiacs living among their leftovers. It's also emotionally satisfying. It says our species has done this before, that there was a previous round of global explorers, a lost age of science and seamanship whose traces we're only just starting to notice. It turns every weird map, every out-of-place artifact, into a potential clue in a much bigger mystery. But if we treat this like a serious hypothesis, not just an atmospheric story, what would we actually need to see? First, a provenance chain. If Piri Reis used an ancient master chart, that chart didn't teleport into his hands. It had to pass through cultures and centuries. We'd expect at least some record of it. Mentions in Greek texts of a strangely precise universal map. Islamic scholars referring to an older superior chart they're copying. Medieval Portolan makers preserving unusual coastlines they don't understand but trust because the ancients drew them. We do see authors talking about older authorities, Ptolemy drawing, on Marinus of Tyre, Islamic geographers citing Ptolemy, Europeans leaning on both. But that's a normal, visible lineage. We use Ptolemy's coordinates. We correct Ptolemy using sailor reports. The chain is right there, and it points to names we know, methods we can evaluate, errors we can track. There's no clear, consistent whisper about some lost, super-accurate pre-classical atlas. Second, consistent technical signatures. Real inherited knowledge leaves fingerprints. Measurement systems, preferred projections, characteristic ways of drawing coasts or gridding the world. If multiple maps, supposedly drawn centuries apart by different cultures, all share an underlying geometry that doesn't match their own era, but does match each other, that's interesting. What we actually see on early world maps is a jumble. Ptolemaic grid systems spliced onto Portolan-style coasts. Medieval to schemes mashed up with new discoveries. Islamic world maps with their own orientation conventions and cosmological assumptions. Oronce Finé's heart-shaped cordiform projection, sitting next to purely practical sea charts. There are patterns, but they're explainable through documented intellectual history. Greek trigonometry into Arabic astronomy into European navigation tables. No hidden, out-of-time math keeps surfacing like a ghost. Third, multiple independent matches. If an ancient Antarctic chart lay behind Piri Reis, you wouldn't expect it to show up once and then vanish. You'd expect echoes of it in other maps that supposedly drew from the same well. Different cartographers, different styles, same weirdly accurate southern coastline. Instead, the Antarctica without ice reading of Piri Reis is basically a one-off. Finé's southern continent looks nothing like it. Other 16th century maps show big southern lands, but clearly as speculative Terra Australis, not precise surveyed coasts. And when people go hunting for correlations, they tend to find them only after heavy distortion and generous interpretation. Exactly the behaviour you'd expect if they're starting from the conclusion and working backward. That doesn't prove an ancient source map never existed. It just means the kind of convergent, multi-map evidence we'd want to see isn't there yet. Now there is a kernel of truth hidden inside the ancient knowledge story, and it's worth taking seriously. Knowledge really does survive collapses. It really does hop cultures. And it really can appear out of nowhere to people who don't see the transmission. The scientific and cartographic tradition that fed into Piri Reis is a perfect example. Babylonian sky watching becomes Greek astronomy. Greek geography is translated, critiqued, and extended in Arabic. Islamic navigators developed sophisticated methods for determining latitude using the stars. Scholars in Al-Andalus and the Eastern Mediterranean compiled detailed regional maps and route networks. Later, Renaissance Europeans, including the Ottomans, inherit all this through trade, war, captured libraries, and hired experts. To a 16th century sailor who doesn't read Greek or Arabic, some of that accumulated precision might genuinely look like magic. A set of numbers or a coastal outline that just works, with no visible explanation. From a distance it can feel like a relic of some unknown past. Up close, it's a chain of very human people writing, copying, arguing, correcting, and occasionally getting things badly wrong. Piri Reis himself tells us this. In his notes, he doesn't invoke Atlanteans. He names Spanish and Portuguese charts. He mentions an Alexandrian map and older sources, but always in the language of known learned traditions. There's no sign that he thinks he's holding something literally prehistoric, only that he's using the best authorities available to him, some recent, some ancient, by his standards. So where does that leave the ancient source map hypothesis? In a curious middle ground. It's not impossible in principle that a now lost culture mapped more than we think. Human beings have been clever for a long time. We are absolutely capable of underestimating what prehistoric sailors could do with simple tools and sharp observational skills. But to jump from that modest caution to a fully global Ice Age era survey that secretly underlies a handful of Renaissance maps that requires evidence we don't currently have. No clear provenance. No consistent technical fingerprint. No chorus of independent, low distortion matches. Just a few suggestive resemblances, a lot of rubbish eating, and a powerful desire for the past to be stranger than our textbooks say. Still, before we dismiss inherited charts entirely, there's a much more grounded version of this idea we need to explore. Not Atlanteans with satellites, but Portuguese pilots with excellent coastal surveys and very real incentives to keep them hidden. To understand this idea, you have to put yourself in the mindset of 15th and early 16th century Portugal. For a brief window of time, they were basically the NSA of the oceans. Decades before Spain really got going in the Atlantic, Portuguese ships were creeping down the west coast of Africa, one cape at a time. They had royal funding, dedicated navigational schools, and a monomaniacal obsession from the crown. Find a way around Africa to the riches of India, and don't let anyone else figure out how you did it. From the 1410s onward, that strategy paid off. Portuguese pilots reached the Madeiras, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands. They inched past the dreaded Cape of No Return myths along West Africa, discovered the bulge of the continent, and by 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral bumped into the coast of what we now call Brazil and claimed it for Portugal. Every step of that journey generated data: latitudes, bearings, soundings, current patterns, landmarks. And that data was treated not as a scholarly curiosity, but as state-level classified information. Leaking it wasn't just frowned upon. In some periods, it was literally a capital crime. This is the world behind the Portuguese secret charts hypothesis. The basic claim is straightforward. Forget Atlantean atlases. You don't need them. By 1513, when Piri Reis drew his map, there already existed extremely accurate, extremely guarded charts of the Atlantic world created by Portuguese cartographers. Those charts showed bits of coastline that weren't widely known. They were compiled into Royal Master Maps, the Portuguese equivalent of the Spanish Padrón Real. And through war, capture, espionage, or defection, fragments of those secret maps ended up in Ottoman hands, then on Piri Reis's world chart. That part is very plausible. We know the Iberians used master charts. Spain's Padrón Real was a central, constantly updated template of imperial geography, stored in the Casa de la Contratación in Seville. Individual sea charts were copied from it for pilots, but the original was closely supervised. Portugal had its own version, often called the Padrão Real or similar terms in modern scholarship, again a controlled official representation of the known world. As new voyages returned, royal cosmographers updated it. They adjusted the shape of Africa as better coastal surveys came in. They tweaked island positions. They slowly extended the edge of the known world. Now imagine you're living in that ecosystem as a foreign power. You might never see the full master chart, but you could get pieces: a captured pilot, a disgruntled cartographer who sells a copy, a spy in Lisbon, a seized Portuguese ship whose rutters and charts end up in a rival port. Those local charts are themselves fragments of the master, already projecting its refined coastlines into the world. And when we look at what the Portuguese actually did map well, the fit with Piri Reis is obvious. By 1513, Portuguese knowledge of Africa's coastline was superb for its time. They had been coasting and trading there for decades. Their latitudes along West and East Africa were quite good. Their outline of the continent, while not perfect, blew Ptolemy out of the water. Same with parts of Brazil. After Cabral's landfall in 1500, Portuguese ships repeatedly touched the South American coast. They explored at least several hundred miles of it. Early charts from the Cantino and Caverio families show a surprisingly recognizable bulge of Brazil, with capes and river mouths plotted in reasonable positions. If Piri Reis got his hands on Portuguese charts of Africa and Brazil, even indirectly via captured Spanish maps that had incorporated Portuguese information, that would neatly explain why his Atlantic coasts look as solid as they do. No mystery civilization required. The leap comes when people try to stretch this into Antarctica. The hypothesis goes like this: Portuguese explorers pushing farther and farther south along the Brazilian coast may have overshot. Maybe they crossed into very high southern latitudes, grazing the fringes of the Antarctic peninsula, or some subantarctic lands. They charted what they saw. Those soundings and sketches went onto a secret chart. Centuries later, that chart's southern margin, misunderstood and misprojected, ends up as the Antarctica on Piri Reis's map. On its face, that feels optimistic. We have a decent documentary record of Portuguese voyages in this period, especially the major crown-backed expeditions. There are gaps and lost logs, sure, but the big southern pushes are conspicuous by their absence. Portuguese strategy was focused overwhelmingly on the Africa-Indian Ocean route, and secondarily on securing their slice of Brazil within the Treaty of Tordesillas. They weren't incentivized to send expensive expeditions exploring far south into uselessly cold waters with no known spice trade payoff. On top of that, the environmental reality matters. The Drake Passage and the Southern Ocean are brutal. It's hard enough for 19th century ships specifically looking for Antarctica. For 15th century caravels accidentally stumbling onto an ice-covered Antarctic coastline, mapping it in enough detail to later look like a clean continental outline, and then having that map vanish from every other record, possible in a bare logical sense. But it's pushing the envelope. A more modest and frankly more convincing version of the hypothesis is that no one reached Antarctica at all. Instead, Portuguese and Spanish charts of South America and the South Atlantic were messy. Latitudes were off, coasts were extended or truncated. Stray reports of islands and headlands, perhaps real, perhaps phantom, got stitched together in odd ways. Now drop those imperfect fragments into the machinery of an Ottoman admiral, trying to synthesize 20 charts and mappe mundi. If you misplot a stretch of the South American coast too far east, if you rotate or shear a copied segment of shoreline. If you're trying to reconcile a long south-trending Brazilian coast from one source with a different, more angled version from another, you can easily produce something that looks like a second landmass continuing beyond the known continent. Especially if you, like every learned cartographer of your age, already believe there ought to be a great southern land down there. In that scenario, the Portuguese secret charts aren't hiding Antarctica. They're providing detailed but inconsistent data on Africa and the Americas. Piri Reis copies them, trying to be faithful. He annotates them with his own notes. He maybe smooths some lines, connects some dangling segments, fills some gaps with conventional Terra Australis. The result is a hybrid coastline, part well-surveyed Brazil, part stretched speculation, part artifact of projection. From our vantage point, if we squint and warp and overlay it on modern Antarctica, we can convince ourselves of a match. But the underlying engine isn't lost Ice Age knowledge. It's 16th century European and Iberian intelligence work, filtered through one more layer of interpretation. So what does this hypothesis actually explain well? It explains why Piri Reis's Atlantic and African coasts are so competent. It explains his own references to Portuguese and Spanish sources. It explains how relatively advanced geographic knowledge still guarded in Lisbon and Seville could show up on an Ottoman map only a few years after Columbus and Cabral. And what doesn't it explain? It doesn't give us a solid reason to think anyone had precise knowledge of an ice-free Antarctic shoreline. It doesn't conjure up documentary traces of ultra-southern Portuguese voyages that we'd expect to have left at least some echo. And it doesn't remove the need to confront projection issues and cartographic conventions when we compare that southern line to modern Antarctica. In other words, the Portuguese secret charts are almost certainly real, and they almost certainly fed into Piri Reis. But the more we ground the story in what those charts likely contained, the less we need them to hide a literal lost continent. To see what might be going on with that southern coastline, we have to look even closer at the nuts and bolts of mapmaking, how coasts get fused, how errors propagate, and how artistic choices can turn scattered reports into a seemingly continuous land. So let's zoom in on that. Imagine you're Piri Reis, sitting in 1513 with a table covered in charts. Some are fresh Portolan sea charts, dense with rhumb lines and coastal place names, focused on navigation, not global geography. Others are older Mappe Mundi, circular, symbolic, with monsters and biblical scenes crowding the margins. A few might be rough pilot sketches, half memory, half guesswork. None of them agree perfectly. Latitudes don't line up. Capes are in the wrong places. Distances feel off. Your job is to turn this chaos into a single, coherent world. The first thing to understand is that not everything on those sources is geography in the way we think of it. Early modern maps are full of symbols, little circles and crosses for ports, stylized waves for dangerous seas, decorative flourishes around compass roses. Sometimes those symbols drift, especially when copies are made from copies. A line that originally marked just a wind-rose boundary, or the edge of a decorated panel, can slowly morph over generations of copying into what looks like a literal coastline. Add to that the artistic impulse. Cartographers were not just technicians, they were artisans. Empty space looked ugly, unfinished, even suspicious to patrons paying a lot of money for a grand world map. So coastlines get finished. Gaps between known segments are smoothed into graceful curves. Island chains are nudged into suggestive arcs. Decorative scrolls of text hug the edges of land and, seen from far enough away, read visually as extensions of that land. Now drop this into the southern Atlantic. You have one chart that shows Brazil running south farther than it really does, another that ends it early but scatters a handful of islands, maybe real, maybe imaginary, down toward higher latitudes. A third, older world map has a hazy Terra Australis drawn along the bottom edge, because everyone knows there must be something there to balance the globe. If you're trying to reconcile them, one temptation is simple: connect the dots. This is coastline fusion. You see a south-trending Brazilian shore from one source, a kinked or rotated Patagonian segment from another, and a line of islands that, with a bit of creative license, could be capes or peninsulas. You stitch them together into a single sweeping southern margin. From your perspective, you're not inventing a continent. You're just avoiding ugly breaks. You're honouring all your sources, giving each a piece of the outline. You're making the edge of the known world look like an edge, not a torn page. Underneath that are the quiet, boring errors that do most of the work. Scale drift as pilots sailed farther from home. Their estimates of distance, based on dead reckoning, often crept. 100 leagues on one stretch might not be the same size as 100 leagues on another. When a cartographer laid these tracks out in ink, he had to choose a compromise that can elongate coasts, dragging them farther north-south than they really are. Compass variation, magnetic declination, the difference between magnetic north and true north, changes with longitude and time. Early pilots generally assumed the compass pointed north enough. Over long distances, especially along a curved coast, that assumption twists your course. A true southwest track might be logged as due south. When plotted, your descent along South America quietly rotates into a slide toward an imagined, more easterly land. Latitude compression and expansion. Determining latitude at sea was still rough. Near the equator, small errors don't matter much. Everything feels flat. Farther south, under unfamiliar skies and bad weather, errors multiply. Some charts squeeze high latitudes together, others stretch them. When those charts get rescaled to fit a single frame, segments migrate. A headland that belonged at 40 degrees south might end up sketched at 55 degrees, protruding into what looks like polar waters. Individually, none of these mistakes screams Antarctica. Together, layered through multiple copying cycles, they can bend a long, ragged South American coast and its adjacent islands into something that, to a later eye, resembles a continuous Antarctic fringe. And remember, we don't even have the full Piri Reis map. What survives is a jagged fragment, the western half of a larger world chart. The bottom edge is literally torn. We're looking at a partial coastline that simply stops mid-curve. We don't know what was drawn beyond that tear. Did the land swing back north? Did it break into islands? Did Piri add text saying this region is unknown or based on hearsay? It's gone. That missing context is a playground for overconfident reconstruction. Modern enthusiasts extend the fragmentary line using whatever best fits their theory. They mirror it, stretch it, rotate it, project it onto globe models. They assume the torn edge once followed the exact contour they're comparing it to. But we're reverse engineering an absent drawing from a surviving sliver, then insisting the sliver encodes precise, ice-free Antarctic geology. If you've spent time with historical maps, that feels like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a few bars hummed by a drunk. The misinterpretation hypothesis, by contrast, doesn't need any hidden genius. It assumes that Piri Reis did what almost every cartographer of his era did. He synthesized messy information, respected authoritative errors, smoothed where he had to, decorated where he could, and filled the terrifying blank at the edge of the world with a respectable continuous coast. It assumes later readers, primed by modern projections and by the romance of forbidden knowledge, are the ones turning that artistic error-laden margin into a high-precision, ice-free Antarctic shoreline. In historical cartography, That kind of mundane explanation tends to win. When we see strange islands, they're usually traced back to a misread log or a double-plotted cape. When we see phantom continents, they're almost always accumulations of little mistakes, circular reasoning, and inherited guesses, not secret expeditions that somehow left no other trace. That doesn't make the Piri Reis map less fascinating. It makes it more human because inside that jagged southern coast, you can see centuries of navigators, scribes and map makers trying to wrestle the unknown into a satisfying shape. And in our eagerness to find Antarctica there, we might just be repeating their mistake, projecting our expectations onto a world that, at the time, was still very much unfinished. To test just how far this pattern goes, we have to step back and look at the bigger picture. Piri Reis isn't the only map people claim shows the impossible. Piri Reis is part of a whole genre. Maps that supposedly shouldn't exist, but do. Take the Zeno map. In the late 1500s, a Venetian noble named Niccolo Zeno, the Younger, publishes a book. In it, he claims to have found old family letters and a map in his attic. These, he says, record a voyage made by his ancestors a century before Columbus. The Zeno brothers, sailing north, supposedly reached unknown islands in the North Atlantic, maybe even parts of North America. The accompanying map shows a strange Arctic world. There's Friesland, a big island south of Iceland that does not exist. There are mysterious coasts labelled Estotiland and Drogeo that some people later tried to link to Labrador or Newfoundland. For a while, this map sneaks into serious atlases. Cartographers copy Friesland over and over. They give it cities, harbours, even political boundaries. It becomes as real on paper as Ireland. Then the cracks start showing. Scholars notice that the supposed 14th century details look suspiciously like mid-1500s knowledge rearranged. The place names often match later sources better than earlier ones. Some of the old letters look like they were written by someone who had already read printed travel accounts. The geometry of the map doesn't match 1300s techniques. It feels like a 1500s compilation masquerading as a lost chart. Most historians now see the Zeno map as, at best, a heavily embellished family legend, at worst, a straight-up hoax. Why fake it status, national pride, in an age when every European power wanted to claim priority in discovery? My ancestors got there first was a powerful story. A convenient attic find supplied exactly the evidence Venice needed. Now jump to the Vinland map, the poster child of impossible cartography. In the 1960s, Yale announces something electrifying, a medieval world map, supposedly from around 1440, that clearly shows a landmass labelled Vinland west of Europe. If real, it would be smoking gun proof that someone in Europe had a map of North America decades before Columbus. It had everything conspiracy-minded people love. Secret medieval knowledge, a lone artifact that rewrites history, an elite institution vouching for it. But from the start, people were uneasy. The map's style was off. The ink lines looked modern. The parchment was old, but parchment can be reused. Over the next decades, chemists, historians and conservators took turns at it. Analyses of the ink found modern titanium compounds not used in the Middle Ages. The drawing looked like it copied known 20th century reconstructions of medieval maps, not actual medieval practices. Today, the consensus is clear. The Vinland map is a 20th century forgery, made on old parchment, designed to look like a missing link in the chain of discovery. And yet both the Zeno map and the Vinland map did something important. They exploited a real historical fact. Norse voyages to North America did happen. We have Lance Ork's meadows in Newfoundland. We have sagas that, while legendary, preserve kernels of truth. Vikings reached the New World centuries before Columbus. The hoaxes didn't invent that reality. They piggybacked on it. They took a genuine later discovery and projected it backwards, wrapping it in the prestige of older documents. Once people know something is true, Norse in America, Antarctica existing, the Pacific stretching wider than Columbus thought, it becomes tempting to imagine earlier, hidden knowledge that must have been there all along, and even when maps are genuine, they're rarely purely factual. Look at early modern depictions of the North Atlantic. You'll see sea monsters, islands that blink in and out of existence from one edition to the next. Brazil Island west of Ireland. Antillia, a big rectangular island that never quite makes up its mind whether it's real. These aren't all hoaxes. Many are honest attempts to reconcile rumours, navigational errors, and theoretical geography. A pilot swears he saw land through fog, another misreads a cloud bank. A third copies their log without the original doubts attached. A mapmaker, working decades later, sees 3 different somewhere out there reports and fuses them into one confidently inked island. You can have an authentic 1500s chart, drawn in good faith, that still shows places that never existed. Or consider Terra Australis itself. For centuries, perfectly respectable cartographers drew a huge southern continent, not because they'd seen it, but because they thought it had to be there to balance the land in the north. It was a philosophical commitment, not an observational one. Actual voyages that didn't find it were reinterpreted as skirting its edge. Empty seas were quietly relabeled as unexplored coasts. In other words, a real map can contain real coasts, real currents, and real islands, wrapped around imaginary landmasses and speculative shorelines. So what do we do with impossible maps? One option is knee-jerk skepticism, assume fraud, fabrication, or total nonsense. That misses a lot. Even forged or mistaken maps tell us something real about the period that made them, about ambitions, fears, rivalries, and the state of knowledge at the time. The other option is uncritical belief. Assume that any anomaly proves a hidden civilization, a lost technology, or a suppressed voyage. That's how we end up using the jagged edge of a torn chart as proof of precise, ice-free Antarctic geology. A better approach is slower and less satisfying, but more powerful. Ask 4 questions. First, provenance. Where did this map come from, physically and historically? Do we know its chain of custody? Does its dating match the materials and techniques used? Second, context. Does the map fit the broader cartography of its era, or does it magically anticipate knowledge that doesn't show up anywhere else for centuries? Third, mechanism. If it really shows something ahead of its time, how would that information plausibly have been gathered and transmitted? Are there ships, logs, political motives, or trade patterns that could explain it? Fourth, error pattern. Are the hits on the map surrounded by the same kinds of distortions, guesses, and myths we see on other maps? Or is someone cherry-picking a few coincidental matches while ignoring everything that doesn't fit? When you apply that framework to Zeno, the story contracts. The map looks more like a patriotic fantasy compiled from later sources than a miraculous record of pre-Columbian voyages. When you apply it to the Vinland map, the ink chemistry and stylistic oddities drown out the tantalizing word Vinland on the edge of the page. And when you apply it to Piri Reis, the picture that emerges is not a secret ice-free Antarctic survey. It's a sophisticated, messy, early 16th century synthesis. Some accurate New World coasts, some inherited Portuguese knowledge, some speculative southern land, plus all the artistic filling in and coastline fusion we've already talked about. The pattern of controversy is the same every time. Nationalism wants to claim we were first. Hoaxers and hopefuls supply the missing artifact. Later discoveries get retrofitted into older maps. Genuine charts, rich with real data, still carry mythical lands along for the ride. And modern readers, armed with satellite imagery and hindsight, scan those old ink lines for prophetic accuracy that was never really there. That's why the Piri Reis debate refuses to die. It sits right at the intersection of real exploration, genuine cartographic genius, honest error, mythic Terra Australis thinking, and our own appetite for forbidden knowledge. To see just how far that appetite can stretch things, we need to look at what happens when modern science, coastline matching, bathymetry, and all the rest tries to squeeze precision out of those 500-year-old lines. This is where the conversation usually jumps from history into something that sounds like science. You'll see side-by-side diagrams. On one side, the Piri Reis fragment, blown up, traced, maybe flipped or stretched. On the other side, a modern satellite image of Antarctica, but not the one you're used to. Not the white ice-capped outline on a globe. Instead, it's the bedrock map, what the continent would look like if you could peel off all the ice and drain the ocean. The claim goes like this: look, the old map matches the subglacial topography. The shape underneath the ice. That means someone must have mapped Antarctica when it was ice-free. It sounds devastatingly technical. Subglacial topography, bathymetric contours, isostatic rebound. Sprinkle in a few scientific papers about radar surveys under ice sheets, and it feels like we've moved far beyond armchair speculation. But slow down and look at what's actually being compared. First, those subglacial coastlines are not coastlines in any normal sense. They're not the line where land meets water. They're contour lines drawn along some arbitrary elevation under an ice sheet that is miles thick in places. The real present-day coastline of Antarctica is mostly the edge of the ice, not the edge of bedrock. In some places, the ice extends far over the ocean as floating shelves. In others, the bedrock is below sea level, and the ice is sitting like a giant plug in a flooded basin. If you magically removed all the ice, the sea would rush in, the land would rebound upwards over thousands of years, and the shoreline you'd end up with would depend on how you model all of that. So when someone says this 1500s pen line matches the ancient ice-free coastline, you have to ask, which one? The hypothetical coastline at today's sea level if you delete ice and ignore rebound. The coastline after the crust has slowly sprung back up. The coastline during the last interglacial when global sea levels were different. All of those will look a bit different, and all of them are products of computer models and choices, not direct observation. The same applies offshore. Modern bathymetry, the shape of the seafloor, is incredibly detailed compared to anything Piri Reis could have known. We can trace submarine canyons, continental shelves, deep ocean trenches. When enthusiasts say the Piri Reis map matches bathymetric contours, they're usually talking about eyeballing some rough similarity between a wobbly line on parchment and a very complicated undersea landscape. But similarity to what, exactly? You can pick one contour line, say the edge of the continental shelf at 200 meters depth, and stretch and rotate the old coastline until something kind of lines up. If that doesn't look convincing, you pick a different depth. Or you trim off the parts of the antique coastline that clearly don't match, and keep the one promising segment. This is where real scientific practice and the way these arguments are presented diverge sharply. If you truly wanted to test whether an old map encodes real subglacial or bathymetric information, you wouldn't do it by holding two images next to each other and saying, "See, they look similar." You would pick a projection and stick to it. Decide how you're going to put a curved Earth onto a flat map in a consistent, mathematically defined way. No freehand warping until things line up. Define in advance what you're comparing. For instance, the position of major capes along a stretch of coastline, or the general curvature of a bay, or the width of a peninsula at a given latitude. Quantify the fit. Use something like least squares error, correlation coefficients, or shape-matching algorithms to measure how close the old line is to the modern one. Don't just say the angle looks the same, turn it into numbers. Establish a null model, ask, if I take a random squiggly line of the same length and I'm allowed to rotate and scale it, how often can I get a match this good purely by chance? How many degrees of freedom am I giving myself with stretching, flipping, cropping? Then you'd see whether the Piri Reis match actually stands out from coincidence, or whether it's the kind of similarity that shows up all the time when you overlay old coastlines and modern maps in creative ways. When researchers who actually specialize in geodesy, cartography, or Antarctic geology have looked at these claimed matches, that's more or less the procedure they have in mind. And their verdict, repeated in different forms over the last few decades, is pretty consistent. Once you strip away the hand-picked alignments and the imaginative relabeling, the statistical evidence for a real, precise match just isn't there. Instead, you find all the usual suspects. Incomplete data. We don't know Antarctic bedrock perfectly. In some regions, especially under thick interior ice, even modern models have big error bars. That means you can tweak reconstructions and get coastlines that shift noticeably, which conveniently gives more room to improve the fit with an old map. Subjective selection. Proponents rarely compare every part of the Piri Reis coastline to every part of Antarctica. They focus on one section that looks promising and declare victory, while ignoring neighbouring segments that would ruin the impression of accuracy. Reconstruction assumptions, small choices about where to cut off an ice shelf, how to treat submerged basins, or what sea level to assume can nudge the modelled coastline into rough agreement with an old chart. Those aren't necessarily bad choices, but they're choices, and if they're guided by the desire to confirm a match, they're not neutral. The broader pattern across credible scholarship is this. Yes, with enough scaling, rotating, and wishful thinking, you can make bits of Piri Reis resemble bits of an ice-free Antarctic outline or the edge of a continental shelf. But when you lock down the rules, formalize the comparison, and check how surprising the match really is, it doesn't hold up as extraordinary evidence. What remains is entirely compatible with what we've already seen. A 16th century map that's surprisingly good for its time at showing parts of South America, full of distortions typical of its era, and draped over a speculative southern landmass that later readers, armed with modern datasets, are trying very hard to see as something more. And that trying very hard turns out to be the real engine of the mystery. Because once you've convinced yourself the old lines hide advanced geophysical knowledge, you need a story big enough to explain it. That's where psychology, media, and the allure of forbidden knowledge take over from cartography. Our brains were never designed for satellite images and contour plots. They were designed for staying alive on the savannah. You walk through tall grass, you see a flicker of motion. Is it a predator, or just the wind? If you assume it's nothing and you're wrong, you die. If you assume it's something and you're wrong, you waste a little energy being jumpy. Evolution leans hard toward jumpy. Psychologists have a word for this: apophenia. Seeing patterns in noise, hearing a voice in static, finding a hidden message where there's only randomness. It's not a bug in human perception. It's a survival feature turned loose in a world of data we were never built to handle. Show that same brain a wobbly coastline on a 1500s map, and a complicated satellite reconstruction of Antarctica's bedrock, and it does what it's always done. It grabs onto any similarity it can find, and shouts, "Match!" The more vague and squiggly the lines, the easier this gets. Our minds are incredibly generous pattern matchers. Give them enough wiggle room, rotate this, stretch that, ignore the bits that don't fit, and they'll conjure meaningful alignments where none exist. This isn't stupidity. It's the same cognitive machinery that lets us read each other's faces, infer social rules, and invent stories. The problem is, in this case, the story comes first. The data is what gets bent, and once a compelling story is in place, something else kicks in. Repetition. The Piri Reis map didn't become famous because dozens of careful academic papers slowly built a consensus about its Antarctic accuracy. It became famous because one spectacular interpretation got repeated over and over. A documentary frames it as an unsolved riddle. A charismatic narrator says, "Modern science cannot explain." A few cherry-picked quotes from old articles appear on screen. The idea that this is a map of Antarctica without ice gets said once, twice, 10 times in the same hour. Then that documentary gets clipped, uploaded, reposted, turned into TikToks and Reddit threads, and top 10 unexplained maps videos. Each step strips away a little nuance and adds a little confidence. By the time it hits a meme page or a conspiracy forum, it's no longer "some have argued this might resemble an ice-free coastline," though the evidence is debated. It's "ancient maps prove Antarctica was surveyed thousands of years ago." Psychologists call these factoids, claims that feel true simply because you've heard them so often. The fluency of the statement, how easily it comes to mind, gets misread as evidence. If everyone's saying it, doesn't that mean someone must have checked? Meanwhile, actual skepticism, the boring kind that asks about projections and error bars, gets a very different narrative treatment. When historians or geologists say, "Hold on, that match isn't statistically impressive," that can be framed as caution or as suppression. If you're already invested in the idea that the map encodes forbidden knowledge, institutional doubt becomes part of the story. It's not "these people are doing their jobs." It's "they don't want you to know." Now every peer-reviewed criticism looks like a cover-up. Every "we don't have evidence for that" sounds like we're hiding something. That dynamic is powerful because it's emotionally satisfying. It makes you one of the few who get it. The mystery becomes a kind of identity badge. You're not just curious about an old map. You're part of a group that sees through the lies. And the internet is designed to reward that feeling. Search for Piri Reis once, and your recommendations fill with content that reinforces the most dramatic version of the story. Algorithms don't care what's true, they care what keeps you watching. Uneventful technical debate about 16th century hydrography doesn't compete well with proof of a lost civilization, so the cycle feeds itself. Apophenia finds a pattern, a striking narrative wraps around it. Media repetition hardens that narrative into a factoid. Skepticism gets cast as censorship, which raises the stakes and makes the theory feel even more important to defend. Each new person who hears the story adds their own tweaks, their own diagrams, their own overlays, and the whole thing grows. So what do you do with that if you want to stay curious without getting lost? A few practical habits help. Whenever you hear a big claim, ask, "What would the world look like if this were false?" Not, "Can I imagine a way it might be true?" but "What's the simplest, most boring explanation that still fits the evidence?" Notice the degrees of freedom. If somebody had to rotate, stretch, crop, and reinterpret half the labels on a map to get a match, that's not forbidden knowledge. That's creativity. Distinguish between primary and secondary sources. What did Piri Reis actually write on the map? What do contemporary documents say about his work? Then, separately, what are authors in the 1900s and 2000s claiming about it? The further away from the original you get, the more room there is for embroidery. And pay attention to how people treat uncertainty. Anyone who says no one can explain this, while ignoring entire shelves of explanations, is not doing investigation. They're doing marketing. None of that means you have to stop enjoying the mystery. In fact, there's a deeper wonder here that doesn't depend on lost super-civilizations or secret ice-free surveys. Think about what Piri Reis actually accomplished, using nothing we would recognize as advanced technology. No satellites, no GPS, no sonar, just dead reckoning magnetic compasses, pilot books, word-of-mouth reports from sailors who might have been drunk half the time, and fragments of older charts copied and recopied. Out of that chaos, he and his contemporaries stitched together a recognizable image of whole continents. They turned waves and wind and rumour into a map that, in many places, lines up impressively well with what we see from orbit. That's the real forbidden knowledge here, not that someone mapped Antarctica 10,000 years ago, but that humans with almost nothing to work with built a surprisingly accurate picture of a planet they could barely cross. The danger of the more fantastical readings is that they distract from that genuine achievement. They make the ordinary brilliance of historical navigation look inadequate, when in reality it's astonishing. You don't need Atlantean surveyors under the ice to make this map remarkable. You just need to look closely at what real people actually did, and at how our very human tendency to see more than is really there keeps the legend alive. So let's catch our breath and take stock. We've gone from a single dramatic claim, this map shows Antarctica without ice, to a messier, more interesting picture. At this point in the story, what does the Piri Reis map actually seem to show? The most secure ground is the northern part, the west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America. Those are solid. The shapes, the capes, the general proportionality. This is 1500s cartography working more or less as advertised. When people say Piri Reis was a skilled compiler of the best geographic knowledge of his time, this is what they mean. Things get fuzzier as you move south. The lower stretches of South America are plausible, but stretched. The coastline starts to curl and bend in ways that don't line up cleanly with modern maps. You can still see what he was going for, but it's like a drawing that's been copied a few times and drifted off model. And then there's the famous southern extension, that long sweeping landmass under everything else. This is where confidence collapses. The labels are vague, the shapes are crude, and there are obvious projection problems. Parts that should be far apart get squashed together. Coasts that should be angled sharply are mellowed into a kind of generic wiggle. It's not a clean, photorealistic coastline. It's a stitched-together guess, nudged around by the constraints of the parchment and the style of the day. So if we had to summarize the map in one sentence based on everything so far, it would be something like Piri Reis drew a reasonably good North Atlantic and Atlantic South America, sitting on top of a very uncertain southern blob that mixes partial knowledge, speculation and cartographic tradition. With that in mind, let's actually rank the leading explanations for that southern blob. As of now, with all the uncertainty on the table. At the top of the list, projection and stitching artifacts. This isn't glamorous, but it fits the evidence best. Piri Reis tells us he's copying from 20 charts and Mappe Mundi. Those sources probably didn't all use the same scale, projection or orientation. Some were Portolan charts built around compass bearings. Others were more world picture style. Some may have exaggerated certain regions for political or practical reasons. When you try to force those into one unified map, weird things happen. Coasts get fused, islands become peninsulas, a bent shoreline straightens out, or vice versa. A southern portion of South America might drift further south and curve under in a way that looks, from our satellite-trained eyes, like the edge of another continent. This explanation doesn't require lost civilizations or ice-free surveys. It just needs a working cartographer doing his best with inconsistent raw material. It predicts exactly the kind of distortions we see: recognizability up north, chaos growing as you push into less charted waters. Second place, the Terra Australis tradition. Long before Piri Reis, educated Europeans and earlier scholars were convinced there must be a vast southern continent to balance the land in the north. This wasn't based on exploration, it was philosophy, symmetry, and a little bit of wishful thinking. By the early 1500s, that idea is already in the air. So when mapmakers reach the edge of confirmed coastline, they don't just stop. They blend what's known with what's expected. They extend headlands, fatten promontories, and let an unknown south fill in the gaps. On this reading, the southern landmass is not a surprise at all. It's exactly what you'd expect a learned Ottoman admiral to draw if he's trying to synthesize cutting-edge sailing reports with older, more speculative worldviews. A partly real, partly imagined southern world, third place. And this is where the speculation really starts, the secret Portuguese charts hypothesis. The idea here is that Portuguese explorers had mapped far more of the southern oceans than they publicly admitted, and that Piri Reis somehow got access to some of those hidden charts through captured pilots or seized documents. There is a kernel of plausibility. We know maritime powers guarded navigational data. We know there were pilot books and rutters that didn't circulate widely. And Piri Reis himself boasts about capturing an infidel ship and using its charts. But when you look at the specific claim that these secret charts recorded detailed Antarctic coastlines, maybe even ice-free ones, the evidence thins out quickly. The southern shapes on his map simply do not have the crispness you'd expect if they came from careful first-hand coastal surveys. They look like everything else from that latitude in that era, distorted, uncertain, and heavily filtered through projection style and tradition. Could Portuguese sources have contributed? Very likely. Do we need them to have reached Antarctica to explain what we see? No. Routine voyages farther down the South American coast are plenty to generate confusion and overextension at the map's edge. Everything beyond that, ancient source maps, Atlantean surveys, antediluvian scientists with global charting projects, that's not even in the top 3. Those theories require huge extra assumptions, advanced civilizations that left almost no trace, but somehow seeded just enough maps to create one suspicious coastline. They don't explain more of the data, they just add more story. Now, what would actually move these rankings? If someone discovered an independent 15th or early 16th century chart, clearly predating Piri Reis, with a southern coastline that matches modern Antarctica far better than chance, that would be interesting. Especially if it came with clear labels, consistent projection, and some contextual documents explaining where the data came from. Or if we found an internal Piri Reis notebook or an Ottoman archive entry, explicitly describing a southern land mapped by those who sailed beyond Cape Horn, or similar, with coordinates and distances that checked out. That would strengthen the more extensive Portuguese exploration angle in a concrete way. On the other hand, more overlaid images, more if you rotate it like this and ignore that part, it lines up perfectly. Probably won't change much. Neither will more repetition of the same old quotes out of context, or more books that start with, "No one can explain this," and then skip all the existing explanations. We've already got enough data to say, the boring cartographic explanations work surprisingly well. To overturn that, you'd need new primary sources, not just new enthusiasm. But I'm curious where you land. If you had to rank the explanations right now, projection and stitching error, Terra Australis tradition, secret charts, ancient lost civilization, how would you order them and why? Which specific detail in the map, or in the story around it, pushed you one way or another? Drop your theory in the comments. but also say what evidence would make you change your mind. Not just what you believe, but what could, in principle, convince you you're wrong. That's where this gets really interesting. And if you like this kind of dive into unsolved mysteries that turn out to be more complex than the meme version, I've got something you'll probably enjoy. On the channel's website, there's a new book that walks through 12 of the most talked about unexplained mysteries, maps, artifacts, strange documents, and picks apart what we really know and what we don't. The link is in the description, and for this week, there's a discount running for viewers of this video. It's the same approach we're using here. Curiosity first, drama welcome, but always with an exit ramp back to evidence. For now, keep your mental rankings in mind, because in the next part, we're going to stress test them. We've looked at psychology, history, and cartography. Now we're going to push harder on the remaining loose ends. What modern science actually says about supposed coastline matches, and why, even after all that, this mystery refuses to go quietly. So where does that leave us with the map that shouldn't exist? If you strip away the memes, the documentaries with ominous music, the screenshots of overlaid coastlines, you're left with something both less explosive and way more interesting. Piri Reis almost certainly did not draw a clean, satellite-accurate outline of Antarctica without ice. There's no solid evidence he had access to data that required radar, sonar, or an advanced global survey network. What he did have was something else that's genuinely remarkable, a front row seat in the middle of a knowledge explosion, and the courage to try to stitch it all together. He tells us what he's doing in his own notes, 20 charts, Mappe Mundi, sailors' reports, captured documents. Some new, some old, some based on experience, some based on assumption. He wasn't a prophet of lost civilizations. He was a working editor of the world's geography, trying to reconcile clashing sources with the tools of his time. And that, if anything, is the real secret of the Piri Reis map. Knowledge doesn't usually arrive as a perfect picture. It shows up as fragments, conflicting stories, half-right coastlines. A headland drawn twice, then merged into one. A rumour of land to the south that might be a continent, or an island chain, or just wishful thinking. Cartographers like Piri Reis had to make judgment calls. Which source do you trust? How far do you extend this coastline before you admit you don't know? Do you leave blank parchment, or do you let philosophy and tradition spill into the empty space? 500 years later, we stare at the end result and read backward. We see shapes our brains are wired to find. We project our own expectations onto his guesses. We confuse the map with the territory and the compilation with the original. And when something looks too good or too modern, it tempts us to skip a step: provenance. Where did this information come from? What are the intermediate links? Can we actually trace a chain of evidence? Or are we filling gaps with story because story feels better than we don't know? That's not just a cartography problem. It's a pattern that shows up in almost every historical mystery. You've got methods. How was the data gathered? With what tools? Under what limitations? You've got incentives. Who stood to gain by exaggerating, simplifying, or just making stuff up? And you've got bias, ours and theirs. Renaissance scholars expected a southern continent. Modern audiences raised on ancient aliens content expect suppressed high-tech civilizations. Both expectations shape what we think must be true before we've really weighed the evidence. When the next impossible artifact, map, or inscription hits your feed, you can run the same checklist. What's the provenance? Do we know where it came from? Who handled it? Who copied it? What are the methods? Is the claimed precision actually compatible with the tools of the time? What are the incentives? Who benefits from hyping, faking, or romanticizing this thing? And where might my own hopes and fears be doing the talking? If you apply those questions to the Piri Reis map, the mystery doesn't vanish. There are still uncertainties. We can't say, with 100% confidence, exactly which Portuguese charts he saw, which medieval mappe he leaned on, or how far some explorers might have pushed down the South American coast before anyone wrote it down. We can't absolutely disprove that someone, somewhere, reached Antarctic waters earlier than the record shows. History is full of lost voyages, but can't disprove is not the same as must have happened. The bar for rewriting global history is higher than a suggestive coastline and a handful of dramatic claims. So for now, the most defensible place to stand is here. Piri Reis built a hybrid map from messy human sources. The northern parts show the power of accumulated observation. The southern blob shows the distortions that happen when speculation and tradition seep into the gaps. And our modern myths about Antarctica without ice show how easy it is to misread both. If you enjoyed walking that line between wonder and evidence, there's more where this came from. On the channel's website, there's a book that dives into 12 of the biggest prehistoric and historical secrets, including maps like this, and teases apart what's solid, what's shaky, and where the real mysteries still live. The link is in the description if you want to go deeper. And if you want to see more long-form investigations like this, it really does help to support the channel. Hit like if this changed how you see the Piri Reis map. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what you think the map really shows, and what evidence would actually change your mind. Also, let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these rabbit holes travel. Thanks for sticking with this one. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and I'll see you in the next mystery.